Okay, welcome back to UTOR Business Studies, and particularly welcome back to marketing. This video is going to focus on the start of, we're picking up again on influences and those influences that are relevant to us that have not been covered yet, that we'll be covering after the mid-year exam. So before the exam, we looked at the various factors influencing customer choice. Okay, now we're going to move on to particularly consumer law and then specifically ethics. For this video, we'll start off looking at consumer law, and then subsequent videos will look at deceptive and misleading advertising, price discrimination, implied conditions, as well as warranties, and then moving on to ethics. So in the context of consumer law, there are four main things we'll look at that I've just mentioned. So deceptive and misleading advertising. So as a marketing executive, you need to be aware of some of the laws around deceptive and misleading advertising, and ensuring that you're not being deceptive with the marketing that you're undertaking. You need to be aware of price discrimination and what it means to discriminate on price, and understand that there are certain situations where that might be illegal. You need to understand what implied conditions mean, and also the laws around warranties. So to get started on consumer law, firstly you need to have a good understanding about what consumer law actually is. And as it says on your screen there, it is illegal for business to make statements that are incorrect or likely to create a false impression. And that really encapsulates consumer law. And we'll have a look at some specific examples of deceptive and misleading advertising, for example, and price discrimination. But before we do, we need to understand the role that the law plays and how it has changed over recent times. A part of that is also fine print and disclaimers, and it's important to understand at this point in time that a business cannot fall back on small print or fine print to get itself out of a potentially misleading statement. So for example, a marketing campaign can't make some statement, for example, take these Swiss multivitamins and you will sleep better, and then in small print say, you'll only sleep better if you've done 3 hours of exercise on that day. Okay, that is deceptive and that is misleading. Now, Swiss have been accused in the past of similar types of misleading statements, not with the fine print, but just making claims that they could not substantiate. And that can also be deemed to be deceptive and misleading. So as a second point there, it says if your business needs to qualify its advertisements, make sure the qualifying statements are clear and prominent so that consumers know what the real offer is. We'll get into that a little bit later in the topic. There's an example of an advertisement that is, the real thing versus what was advertised. Again, we'll get more into that when we get into ethics. But it raises the issue that from a marketing perspective, marketing executives must know what they can and can't do. And it's not ethical, and it also could be deemed to be deceptive and misleading to advertise a hamburger such as that one there from Burger King, and for have it to look like that in the ad, where in reality the real burger looks something like that. These are examples we'll look at in class of where the consumer law was appropriate. So from a consumer law perspective and from a legal perspective, 2011 things changed in relation to Australian consumer law. Previously there were 17 state and federal consumer laws, and they were all effectively bundled into one new consumer law, the Australian consumer law, in 2011. And they were replaced by one law which covered effectively everything within this area. We'll have a look at this in class, but on page 148 of your textbook, there is a diagram there which goes a long way to explaining the 6 key elements of the ACL. 2 of the most important things to understand about the Australian consumer law is that it is enforced by both ASIC, so the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, and it's also enforced by the ACCC, so the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, depending on whether it is financial services related, so for ASIC, or whether it's competition related for the ACCC. So within Australian consumer law, there is one main act, an Act of Parliament, which covers all these issues in relation to consumer law, and that is the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010, which superseded or took over from the Trade Practices Act 1974. That particular Act of Parliament is enforced by the ACCC, and it's the main Act of Parliament, or the main law that relates to consumer law. There are 2 main things that particular Act, and in fact consumer law, attempts to achieve, and that is to discourage unfair practices So those unfair practices could relate to deceptive or misleading conduct, for example. And it also aims to encourage competition, and that's why the ACCC is one of the enforcers of this particular law. So the Competition and Consumer Act, so before here we're talking about Competition and Consumer Act being enforced by the ACCC. What is the actual act? Well, it was, like I said before, formerly known as the Trade Practices Act. Two main purposes: to protect consumers against undesirable practices. Here, this first point, and secondly, regulate trade practices that restrict competition. So making sure that businesses are not doing things which would stifle competition or which would reduce competition from a marketing perspective. Okay, and as I've said, also it's enforced by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Something else to understand are the consequences. So breaches of the Act can lead to fairly significant fines of up to $1.1 million if found guilty of unconscionable conduct. Okay, that being any practice by a business that is just not reasonable, and often it is illegal. Again, in class we'll look at some examples of businesses that have been fined. Red Bull, for example, for breaching the Competition and Consumer Act, and they were fined some millions of dollars. Okay, so that is just a broad start and an overview to consumer law. The really important things to take out of before we look at the different elements of consumer law are these. Number one, that the Australian consumer law is predominantly is the overarching law now since 2011, and the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010 took over from the Trade Practices Act 1974, and it covers all those elements, or all those times when a consumer could be disadvantaged or where competition might be restricted. And that Act, the Competition and Consumer Act, from a marketing perspective, seeks to ensure that the consumer is looked after and that they are not exploited from a marketing perspective in relation to competition and in relation to the consumption of goods and services.